We have two more talks. We're going to have two more keynotes. Karen Seto will talk in just a second, and Dr. Pretori will follow. But so Karen, sort of a late addition, but we're fortunate to have Karen Seto here, who is the coordinating lead author of the IPCC chapter on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning. This is a new chapter in the latest IPCC report. Karen's a professor of geography and urbanization at the FES, at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and she's also a co-chair of the Future Earth Project on Urbanization and Global Environmental Change. Her research is focused on urban land use change, forecasting urban growth, and environmental consequences of urban expansion. And she specializes in China and India, where she's been working for the past 15 years. So please welcome Karen Seto.
Thanks, Mark. It's nice to be here and fresh off of the IPCC plenary from last week. I taught my class this morning, a class called Climate Change Mitigation in Urban Areas, and I gave them to the up-to-date, blow-by-blow, what happened last week in Berlin. So anyhow, it's nice to be here, to be added on last minute. I have just a few minutes before Patchy comes up and gives the final keynote. What I thought I would do is give a very broad overview on really the three key messages that came out of Working Group 3 of the IPCC. And then I thought I would then zoom in on the 6 key messages from the new chapter, the chapter on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning. Just a little bit of background. I imagine everyone in this room is familiar with the IPCC reports, but just to give a little bit of background on this particular report of Working Group 3, it is a labor of love that involved hundreds of scientists from around the world. The timeline for this report actually started in 2009 with a scoping meeting that took place in Italy, where about 100 or so scientists came around from around the world to identify to develop the annotated outlines for what would be the working groups 1, 2, and 3 reports. So really the planning for Working Group 3 started in 2009, but the writing itself only began in 2011. So the report, Working Group 3, has 16 chapters. There are 235 lead authors and coordinating lead authors, but if you add the contributing authors as well, that actually boosts this number from 235 up to well over 500. So really it has involved a number of authors from around the world. The final report is more than 2,000 pages and includes almost 10,000 references and underwent 3 different rounds of peer review that included more than 38,000 comments. And yes, we responded to every single one, line by line. So in terms of the main key messages from Working Group 3, there are really 3 messages, and really they're quite simple as well. I mean, the first message is not a very optimistic one, and that is that global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase, and they've been increasing at an increasing rate over the last decade, and this is despite increases in mitigation efforts all around the world. So what we're seeing is that although we're seeing increases in mitigation efforts and mitigation policies at the national level, at the subnational level, and also at city levels, we're seeing that emissions are continuing to rise. The majority of the increase in emissions comes from the combustion of fossil fuels and also from industrial processes. The second key message from Working Group 3 is that these emissions are rising, and they're rising along with growth in GDP and also population growth. And here, one of the key findings of the report is that this rise in emissions that parallel the growth of GDP really reverses a long-standing trend of decarbonization of energy. So this second key message is also not very optimistic. The third key message is that we really need to undertake deep cuts now in the very short term. That without more mitigation in the very short term, it's likely that global mean surface temperature might increase by over 3 degrees C and up to almost 5 degrees C over this entire century. So here the key message is that we need to do something soon, and that if we do something sooner, we would actually reduce the risks in the long run. So those are the three key messages from the report. Emissions are increasing at a higher rate. We're saying that if we don't make deep cuts in the very short term, that global mean temperature may rise between 3.5 to almost 5 degrees C over this century. I want to spend about 5 minutes just discussing the main messages from the new chapter on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning, and also give a little bit of context about why this new chapter was developed. So in the past, the IPCC reports, especially Working Group III reports, have focused on mitigation from a sector perspective. What are the mitigation options from the energy sector, from transportation, from buildings, and from industry? And in the past, the issue of how cities and how human settlements can mitigate emissions has been seen through the lens of these individual sectors. About 6-7 years ago, there was a community of us outside of the IPCC who were not involved with the IPCC reports, and we approached a number of co-chairs and the IPCC and said, urbanization is a major trend. It's one of the biggest trends that's facing humanity now, and there is an opportunity to think about mitigation through the lens of human settlements. Little did I know that IPCC would actually take us up on this. And so in 2009, with the scoping meeting in Italy, it was decided that there would be this new chapter on how human settlements would have the potential to mitigate emissions. So this chapter had 2 coordinating lead authors. The other coordinating lead author is Shobhakar Dakal, who is out of Thailand. We had 30 authors, including 17 contributing authors. We received more than 3,000 comments. There was a lot of interest in this chapter from governments from around the world, and our chapter alone has almost 700 references. So we have 6 key messages from this chapter, and the first message is that urbanization is a global trend, and that around the world, urbanization is associated with increases in income, and that higher urban incomes are generally correlated with higher consumption of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And here, it's important to point out that there are stark differences between Annex I and Annex II countries. Here on the left, we have a graph of total final consumption per capita energy for Annex I countries. And what we see here is that in Annex I countries, urban emissions per capita and also urban energy per capita are generally lower than national averages. That is, urban areas, urban residents generally are consuming less energy, emitting less emissions per capita than national averages. But we see a very different trend in non-Annex I countries. And in non-Annex I countries, we see that urban emissions and per capita urban emissions and per capita energy generally is above national averages. And this is not surprising because basically what we're seeing is that in non-Annex I countries, the cities are the manufacturing hubs that are producing the products that we here in Annex I countries are buying. So this explains why we see these differences in per capita urban emissions in Annex I versus non-Annex I countries. Now, the second key message from our chapter, I would say, is a message of hope, and that is that the next 2 decades presents a very unique window of opportunity to mitigate emissions in urban areas, largely because a large portion of the world's urban areas, the buildings, the transport systems, the energy systems, have yet to be built. Over the next 3 to 4 decades, the most recent UN projections suggest that we're going to see somewhere between 2 to 4 billion more people living in cities, in urban areas around the world. And what we're seeing is that over these next 2 to 3 decades, we're going to see a lot of new development in roads and in buildings and in energy systems. And so the opportunity here is to avoid the infrastructure lock-in, to avoid the behavior lock-in that we see in high energy consuming societies. So here I want to really emphasize that this is really a message of hope and really an opportunity that we really need to seize on in the short term. The third key message from our chapter is that while mitigation options really vary by country, by history, by development patterns and urbanization trajectories, what we found in the chapter in the assessment is that urban mitigation strategies are most likely to be effective when policy instruments are bundled together. And here we have a diagram, a figure from the chapter, which shows on the first column some of the key elements of low-carbon cities that would, for example, have high levels of job density, relatively high levels of residential density. And at the same time, low-carbon settlements and low-carbon urban areas will be ones that are connected, where destinations are relatively accessible by a number of different origins. So the key here is to bundle a number of policy instruments together, to not focus on just sector-level individual buildings or just transport, but to really think about integrated land use, transport, and urban planning as the mitigation strategy. One of the things that we found in the assessment is that while the next few decades presents this window of opportunity, this window of opportunity is going to occur largely in developing countries, and it is in the same developing countries where there are limited governance, institutions, technical, and very importantly, really limited financial capacities. And here, there's a lot of discussion among the chapter authors and also across the different chapters on key challenges that are around financing mitigation strategies going into the future. Now, one thing that I think we've seen here in North America and also in Europe is that thousands of cities around the world are implementing climate change action plans. Here in New Haven, I know there's a discussion about a climate change action plan. New York's climate action plan is probably among the most well-known in the United States. What we found was that despite thousands of cities undertaking these climate action plans, their aggregate impacts on reducing emissions is highly uncertain. And the reason for this is multifold. One is that there are not standardized reporting standards, reporting mechanisms. There are a number of very ambitious targets, but again, very unclear accounting mechanisms and reporting mechanisms. And so, although there are a lot of cities around the world that are undertaking these plans and implementing them, it's unclear what their cumulative impacts are in the future, what they will be. And then finally, in terms of how cities can implement these climate action plans and also large-scale or urban-scale mitigation, what we found is that for cities and for localities to be effective with mitigation really requires that mitigation action and mitigation efforts be linked with local co-benefits. In other words, cities around the world, especially those in developing countries, are faced with a number of different challenges, whether these challenges are provision of clean water, energy, sanitation, education. I mean, there are a lot of other pressing, immediate challenges that cities around the world face. And the key message here is that climate change mitigation strategies at the local level are likely to be ineffective unless they can be linked or paired with these pressing concerns that cities are facing around the world. And here I think this is also a message of hope and another window of opportunity, that as cities around the world and countries around the world are investing billions of dollars in new infrastructure, in building the cities of tomorrow, there is an opportunity to think strategically about building cities that are also low-carbon settlements. The chapter highlights a number of knowledge gaps in the science literature. I list them here. I'm not going to read through them. I think for the students who are in the room, this is good news for you, because if you're interested in studying urbanization or climate change or mitigation of climate change in urban areas, this is a very fruitful area of research that should yield decades of science. So with that, I will close, and I think I have time for just a couple of questions. Thank you.